Well, after the last two underwhelming series of the 15th Doctor, with RTD's writing skills wielding maximum power and influence over the Doctor Who character, we ponder how Russell T Davies could have got the stories, the story structure, the Doctor Who formula so wrong, so broken, with musicals, fourth wall breaks, stories that don't deliver, stories laboured by exposition, with no adventure or movement, too much soapy emotional hand-wringing, too much Time Lord folklore, too much complexity that the story can't breathe. We do wonder whether RTD knows what makes a good Doctor Who story. So we want to look at that. And I've got my good friend here, Hugh, to give us an
Hi, everyone.
option, a possible option on the episode that RTD could learn a lot from to get us back on the path of making good Doctor Who. So tell us more, Hugh.
So, I mean, I've said before on the channel that the first episode of Doctor Who is, I think, the finest 22 minutes of television ever made. I think the whole part of it is that it sets up the whole chance to do anything. It's a brilliant piece of exposition because it doesn't go into detail on that. It uses the tropes that were available in terms of television at the time. So if you look at the fact that it does have an element of soap. It feels more like Coronation Street in some ways than
Yeah,
it's necessarily a science fiction program. When it's set in the school, that feels very like any other program that would be a normal non-science fiction program in 1963, but it uses that to then create this complete sense of unease, a sense of the possibilities of what can happen. So the shooting with Waris Hussein in terms of the sort of like going through the door at Trotter's Yard, all of that, and the cutting is quite clever, and it's all very sensible in the sense that it's not claiming anything major, it's not doing a huge dump, and then obviously all of a sudden you get the inset of the TARDIS to be that iconic moment, which is then repeated through the rest of the program. But it's that sense of mystery which I think is now missing, and it becomes the retreads of Sutek, of the Rani, of Omega, uh, they seem as if the well is dry in Russell's way. So I don't get why they don't go back. And part of the thing I'd like to see is almost if they had something where the Doctor didn't know who he was, and you had a discovery over the period of time, because I think currently the Doctor doesn't know who he is, and unfortunately we have to rediscover it.
yeah. I mean, I have been sneaky with this discussion of an unearthly child, particularly part one, compared to what RTD could deliver in 2025, 2026 if he's hanging around. I take your concession that there's an element of the domesticity because we're in the teachers are concerned. There's a lot of chat between the two of them. I like the linear process. I have to say, I think too much TV now has got clever ass and thinks it's clever by showing you the end, then jump into. Okay, it's done. It's a fad. But this story, you follow the viewpoint of the teachers. You have their confusion. You're taken through on their journey into that yard, into that TARDIS, and into the confusion of suddenly being bewildered. I do think we can still do that in 2025, even though everybody knows what Doctor Who is. I mean,
Mhm.
as you say, I think a doctor with amnesia, war torn, whatever, who cares? A doctor who's therefore forgotten how to use the TARDIS at its max, because I'm bored with that. That wouldn't
Mhm.
be too bad, would it?
Yeah, and again, I think it's interesting if you go back and try and think of what it was like in 1963 for the writers, for the producers, the director. What's obvious is that it's just a set of possibilities. To an extent, Canon is a disaster for Doctor Who because it becomes both something that's a guide, but also something where it gets messed up and people use it and for whatever reason. I think the idea where there is more possibility has to be recreated. And I think we're down at this level again of reusing characters in order to make us elderly gentlemen who like Doctor Who happy with it. But it really abuses those characters and abuses the canon in order just to try and get something back, which I don't think that Russell cares enough about creating the possibility anymore. And I think to an extent he did whenever it came back in 2005. And there were more different writers doing more different things, and he allowed that. And it's this closure of the possibilities, which I think in the last two series have been obvious.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I think that we need to return to, and Unearthly Child does it pretty good, is that mood, that atmosphere, taking itself seriously. No nods to camera. No, well, you know where we're going here. No temptation to do some crazy experimentation. The experimentation was in the process of making that program. The experimentation was in doing something pioneering. The experimentation was not, here's something on the screen to break some rule of how we make TV. I just think the writers now, the production team now, are all too knowledgeable, all too self aware, when actually this was focused on telling our story, introducing characters, introducing a new world, and making it sensible to the shocked viewer. Remember, there was no crazy exposition going on here, as in at 100 miles an hour. TARDIS was so cleverly thrown into the discussion. I loved his analogy of comparing Ian Chesterton to, primitives and saying, "Oh, they don't understand," and there was enough there that your brain could go, "Yep, I know where we're going with this. I can see that he's a bit above us, etc., etc." But we didn't get all this Japanese knotweed of canon. We just got what we needed.
And it's done subtly, as you're saying there. It's sort of like it's one or two comments that do it, and it's not something where you go, "Oh, I'm such and such," and I the exposition drives me mad now because it's only there because the writing isn't good enough.
Yeah.
Exposition should be rare in Doctor Who and rare in a program like this, and I think a lot of it we'd moved. If you look at the sort of programs that influenced Russell whenever he came back 2005, you have stuff like Buffy and The West Wing.
Yeah.
And yes, there's exposition in those, but it's done cleverly. And it's built up. It's not this need to shove it in. And I find, again, we've had the discussion about what's an arc. And I don't think Russell knows what an arc is, because there hasn't been an arc in these last two series. It's stuff that's stuck on at the end, and he does that quite a lot to an extent in the first series of New Who with the Return of the Daleks. It's not really an arc at all, and either you commit to having an arc, or you don't and you remove the idea. But this sort of like halfway messy house that is Russell's habit in Doctor Who is just worthless.
And I think one other thing with Unearthly Child that I think we RTD would do well to emulate is linked with this arc, Easter eggs nonsense that goes on. And yes, as you said earlier, because Doctor Who's been going 62 years, the temptation for some producers to just tiptoe in and throw a line like the macra is too strong. And actually, they should be more disciplined. Tell an adventure, introduce a new world, introduce new characters, and leave it at that. There's no need for me to hear, "Oh, there once knew a Sea Devil." That's just. it's kind of it's throwing some food to the zoo animals. It stop it. Just make sure it's a really good story. And this one did it so well. Can you imagine an unearthly child if there were kind of a woman appeared on the planet in the corner and you thought, I wonder who that woman is, and then she appears next week. You know, you saw signs everywhere saying bad wolf. I mean, can you imagine how they could destroy this lovely story if you just threw in all these other missiles of nonsense?
Yeah, again, a lot of it is the Deus Ex Machina aspects of that, which Russell does, where the solution is either more or less magic, and some of that you can get away with. I think I've discussed before. I mean, reversing the polarity of the neutron flow is more or less abracadabra,
Yeah.
but it's done in a way where it takes itself more seriously. And I think there's the thing that I don't really understand, and this is all through New Who and all through Russell's writing, is this idea where most of the time the Doctor doesn't save the world by doing anything. It's quite often a companion that does it, and companions become more and more important, and Stephen Moffat has a lot of blame for that. But you then also get Space Jesus. So you get the Doctor sort of like in dealing with the Master, where he's suddenly not an old man because of the faith of millions on Earth. And that's just weird. And that type of thing again. I've obviously raised with you the question about whether we do something on the use of gods in it. But I think that Russell both writes almost as and this applies to Stephen Moffat as well, almost as an extreme atheist and an extreme faith head. It's really quite a weird dichotomy, and I think that causes real problems.
Yeah. I'll add to that. They almost right now also as if they're bored with the brand they're in charge of as well. They want to break it, shake it up, do something very different. They're bored with just giving you the formula that has seemingly worked. I mean, when you go back to that an unearthly child episode, I remember when we have mentioned it over time, the amount of expectations and things that had to be delivered in 25 minutes. I mean, how many characters were introduced? A new world introduced? A mystery introduced? There was a lot to do. And of course, classy writing, as you said, some really deft touches of direction made that really work. And I really do think I feel underwhelmed when I've seen these two seasons of Doctor Who with this enormous budget. And you look at this Limehouse Studios packing it in, really trying to make that tiny little set do as much as you can. For example, let's compare TARDISes for a second. The wow when you saw that TARDIS in part one of Unearthly Child. And they keep saying and showing characters seeing this new TARDIS of Shooties. Yes, it is cavernous, but it just seems to do nothing. Whereas the William Hartnell TARDIS was a wow.
And again, this is. I think that you should be making Doctor Who almost as a guerrilla program. That again, anything can happen, and you are doing stuff on the cheap, and you are just desperate to try and make things work. And the whole thing where we've got 8 episodes in a season, whenever they were doing 40. Now I know they're shorter,
Yeah,
but the turnover that they're doing is incredible.
yeah,
And the time that it takes is so much smaller. And I think there's a discipline there that gives something, and it's the classic things in terms of what you would have taught in your English class about how you tell a story, and because it works in a linear fashion, and you can do some fancy things with stuff, but because it works in a linear fashion and you don't have an awful lot of time to do it, I think that discipline makes a big difference to how those stories come across.
yeah. And I think one discipline is definitely lost because he's too, familiarity breeds contempt. Russell T Davies feels as though he really knows Doctor Who. So therefore, he feels as though he can tweak it, play with it, do what he wants. But that means, unfortunately, that in many of his scripts, he doesn't He takes a lot for granted. He assumes knowledge and foreknowledge, and he therefore doesn't tell a story. He actually throws things at the screen, and he's obsessed with a scene or a moment. I can't imagine going back to 1963 and when they're in one of their writing meetings and discussing, rushed scripts and everything. Stephen Coburn would be saying something like, "Oh, not Stephen Coburn, Anthony Coburn would be saying something like, um, I haven't got a story, but I can see the scene. I know where I'm heading. I can see a scene when they're running on, the Earth from a million years ago, and there's arrows being fired at them. I can see that scene, darling. I can also see a scene when the doors open to the TARDIS, but I've got no plot and I've got no ideas, but I can see some. No, no, A to B to C to D. And I have to say, that doesn't mean RTD is cleverer. No, it just means he's too familiar with the product, therefore he's actually just trying to shake that formula rather than actually kind of dive into it, work it.
And again, we've got a sort of like very odd conflict here where I think that there's this assumption of knowledge, but then at some point they must go, actually, we haven't really told the story here, so we're going to do all this exposition. So you get both the assuming that the audience knows much more than it does, and then a desperate attempt to try and tell the audience some things that it needs to know for the story to even begin to work. And that's just a mess. This is the problem, that there isn't, in part because Russell has so much power as opposed to the original part of this, where Verity, where Sidney Newman, where the where the writers all contributed. It's now Russell's vision, so therefore it becomes very difficult, I think, for other writers to write within that. And I think that's become really problematic in the last couple of series, as opposed to the start of New Who, where there were encouragement for other writers. And we know, obviously, from the writer's story that Russell did a lot of rewrites, but I think that was then a reasonable approach for him doing that. But it's just got worse and worse, and it's not his. Doctor Who isn't Russell's.
No. I mean, looking back at some of these pictures from An Unearthly Child, especially part one, when it was establishing there were teachers and they were concerned by this unearthly child, etc., etc. Do you know, it does make me wonder about, to a degree, casting and choices being made nowadays. Because, for example, there is no doubt that Ian Chesterton, Barbara, really did reflect the Britain then, society then. So basically, we were very comfortable following them in their unraveling of a mystery. You were safe with them, you believed in them, everything seemed authentic. The society watching that program and those two characters were as one. I sense now, because of various policies and, all the usual stuff going on at the moment, that a lot of casual viewers and British public watching Doctor Who now, if they did, may think that's I don't know, I don't understand what's going on here. I don't understand this character. Why is that character doing that? Why have they picked that done? Why is that? There's too much that's actually not of the norm.
Mhm.
And I think that's a mistake of story writing here.
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting point that it's not that Doctor Who should reflect the norm, but it's that Doctor Who should have people in it that the audience, as a majority of the audience, can see as them.
Yeah,
So you get Ian and Barbara, and they are representatives of us. Okay, in 1963, they're representative of a fairly middle class us, but that's what you're trying to do, is trying to appeal to a set of people. Now, I think the problem with I don't have any problem with there being characters different colour, because apart from anything else, that our society has changed, and it does reflect that, and that's, I think, entirely sensible. But the casting is important for allowing people to think this is about us, but in a completely different world.
yeah. And look, it's true. I mean, you can have, companions of very different ethnic origins nowadays, and that would reflect a wider template from society. I think they just have to be careful that they don't look as though they're talking to almost a niche or minority of society, rather than, the license payers, etc., on who are on mass watching once. The other thing I wanted to talk about with An Earthly Child is the Doctor's character. Because, my God, in 1963, when, let's face it, this show could have just tanked and just disappeared, and the risk was there, but in the writing and in the producing and directing of it, they quite happily made him an anti hero. They quite happily made him quite brusque. They quite happily made him somebody you were wary of. And that, I have to say, is something completely lost now, whether it's the Space Jesus, the neediness of the doctors nowadays, the desperation to be loved. And yet, I think this was so much more interesting.
Yeah, and I think you can obviously do different types of character for the Doctor, and over time that developed. So you have the move into perhaps a much more establishment character with John Pertwee. You have the slightly more mysterious character with Tom Baker. Peter Davison is very nice, and I think you can see the reaction to that with Colin Baker not being nice in an attempt to do it. All of these are reasonable changes, but I think you cannot make the Doctor human. That's the big problem. You cannot make him care as much as he does about things. The closest they came to sort of like Shooty's Doctor, I think, before that was Peter Davison, but it was done. Peter Davison's was done in a much more calm manner, and I think that worked from that point of view. And we've had the discussions before about introducing sexuality into the character of the Doctor, and I think that's disastrous. But the great thing about Hartnell's performance is that it does feel otherworldly. It does feel genuinely odd.
Yeah, I
And
mean,
that,
and it's the way he toys with the teachers in the TARDIS. I mean, he explains to them, he patronizes them, he tells them off, and then he doesn't break the fourth wall, but he's kind of talking to himself about what we're going to do next. It's like, and in essence, selling this new storyline and character, he kidnaps them, really. I mean, you know, I'm not I'm not compromising. And actually, he in this way he was quite risque, because he was stuffed the police. I'm almost camouflaging myself as a police box. Well, I know it was an accident, but and because they said we'll go and get a policeman. Go on then. And it's like you're going, whoa, he's not even following convention here.
and despite all of the criticisms that people make of Hartnell's performance being old and stuff like that, over the entirety of the show, whenever he's on it, it's very hard to overestimate how good he is at doing this. And yeah, some of the writing at the start where they're not quite sure how to write him, and he's not quite sure how to play it, but he gets it right 90% of the time at that very start part. And that's very impressive. And I think people underestimate how much he's contributing to that by creating a character. And
Isn't it fascinating, Hugh? Imagine I'm Shooty Gatwa, or I'm imagining I'm, the 13th Doctor, 12th Doctor character. And you've got all that video to watch to maybe research if you want to understand this character. But as we're saying, William Hartnell got a very brief synopsis, was given a brief outline of his character, obviously embraced it and used imagination and creativity, and really, really, and yeah, 90% or so of the time was getting it to the T. I mean, yes, it developed over time, but this man had no back catalogue to check on. He delivered a new, authentic character. He made somebody who seemed old, who seemed to have a granddaughter, So therefore, there's an element of a relationship and love and care, but also this otherworldliness, this on the run, rebellious element. He had a lot to kind of throw at us and still somehow make us, as the public, want to watch him. I mean,
Mhm.
he had a big task on his hands, and I think we have to, and you've started to do it, underline how, come on, all these other actors, you've got a lot you can all of us dive into and research. You've got stuff. He had nothing.
Mhm. And again, that's to an extent why I was suggesting something like the Doctor with amnesia is to give the actor the opportunity to do that. Because I think nowadays it gets harder and harder because you get the Doctor's meant to be different from the last Doctor, so how the last Doctor was starts dictating how this Doctor should be and stuff like that. And that becomes formulaic in terms of how the Doctor is seen. Whereas I think you should be looking at saying, okay, what is it the public wouldn't expect from this? And by that, I don't mean that necessarily you go with a simple answer. I think you see what can throw the public off of knowing what the Doctor's going to do next.
Mm.
Because the great thing with Hartnell is it's not really clear what he's going to do next because I don't think he knows.
I mean, that's what I mean. It would be really. I think you've set a template that I think has to be followed. It would erase all this temptation to suffocate any character now with all the Japanese knotweed of complicated canon. Simple amnesia, simple, bit like the Doctor then because they took dematerialized early to get away from London. As you know, he then said he had to plot the navigate, and when he was on the dead planet, and it got awful, and oh, it's stuck, it's stuck as a police box, all that stuff. It seemed to be he was still learning how to use the TARDIS. With the amnesia idea, it's like the Time War. One quick line covers
Yeah,
it, doesn't it? But then, I mean, I've added an element where maybe the TARDIS is a little bit more dangerous now. It's more tired. But the point is, that's what you need, this sense of danger, this sense of the unknown. We all think we know the TARDIS now, unlike in 1963. We all think we know the Doctor, unlike 1963. So, yes, the clever trick now is for some writer to create a kind of, oh my god, what's happened to this Doctor? He's erratic, he's unpredictable, he's a bit crotchety, he's a bit angry. Oh my god, he's forgotten how to use the TARDIS properly. Oh my god, the TARDIS is now getting knackered. Something to just make us feel a real sense of danger again.
yeah, and I think obviously, as you mentioned the Time War there, I completely understand why Russell did that, but then it all went wrong because the Time War wasn't really the Time War, and Gallifrey was back, and if you're going to make that type of decision, make it and stick to it. Don't allow all this stuff coming back.
Yeah.
I think it's difficult to think of the Doctor without having Daleks in it at some point. It's difficult to think of it without perhaps um, other Time Lords appearing, but maybe actually think about that because we overdid the Daleks on the return by a lot,
Yes.
and that should go back to whenever they appear once every 3-4 years.
And as we all know, it's like be careful what you wish for. Suddenly Doctor has a budget, and actually suddenly it just feels very meh. When they were stuck in Limehouse Studios and they were stuck with making Scarrow, you see what I mean? And a few Daleks on little trolley wheels type thing. This is the thing. It was about the angles. I mean, when you get to Scarrow, the sound effects there are still. I mean,
Yeah,
a lot of sound effects they invented in 1963 are still used now if you land in Scarrow and it was stunning because they didn't have the money to give you all this lavish set, this amazing CGI. And one thing RTD and the current program makers have not learnt at all is if you say you want 1 million Daleks drawn on the sky, flying, that does not give you drama.
Mhm.
Might give you spectacle for a second, but it gives you a massive problem regarding how you resolve it. I was always concerned you're stuck in a corridor, there's a Dalek coming, and they're going to burn down that door. How do you get out of it? I don't
Yeah,
need 1 million Daleks.
no, and scale doesn't give you that, as you're saying. Scale doesn't give you threat. Scale just looks, oh look, that's amazing on screen or whatever. The again, if you take New Who, uh, the best reaction in terms of Dalek was the reintroduction of Dalek with Dalek, the episode, and Eccleston's reaction to that. Now, that was brilliant because that was actually something new from a Doctor. It set up something which I think was relatively well used through New Who in terms of that relationship, but it's a much cleverer aspect if you're talking to it. Again, it got overdone and you get into the Dalek and stuff like that, where you're just doing the same thing. You're repeating the success of Dalek. And to be fair, Doctor Who is based on repeating success. But I think we have to go back to some form of basics and make it riskier, make it more unusual, strip it back in terms of both budget and that. Because in the end, I don't think it can compete with the Game of Thrones type thing because that's new and it's come along. I think you have to use newness as new type of story writing, but based on how stories work rather than how you think it's going to look really smashing on screen.
So to conclude on An Unearthly Child as the template, really, a reminder to new showrunners and writers, is there a moment in that episode 1 that you would love to see almost replicated in a new version? You know, a piece of dialogue, a moment. For example, as I'm thinking of, it's easy to ask the questions. That dematerialization, that first dematerialization, has never been surpassed.
I think it's very difficult to pick out one aspect of it. I think there's to do one piece of dialogue, the discussion between Ian and Barbara, where they're realizing that Susan is more unusual than they think, and they become committed to doing something about it. So this isn't just two teachers who are going, "Oh, this is an unusual child." It's one where we actually have to go and intervene, which again for the time would be slightly unusual and slightly difficult, but they realize that, and it's the conversation between the two of them. And I think because that such perfect casting for that became naturalistic, but at the same time slightly weird. And that's the skill. If you do that, that's what you need.
Yeah, they were concerned for the child. They weren't looking at each other thinking, I want to go to bed with you as well. There was no other agenda.
Yeah.
That's it. I mean, I had to throw in the please less sex, RTD, please. Just give us some adventure. Well, thanks for that, Hugh. I mean, I know it's a episode that a lot of us really love to see. It's on the money. It is really well put together, and I know there was a pilot and all the rest of it, but surprise, surprise, yes, they were trying to get it right. What should this be like? So, thank you for your time on this one. So RTD, if you're out there, have a look at that again. You overcomplicating things. Let's just get back to how it could look, how it could feel. We've got some easy resolutions if you want to get on the phone to us. Thanks, Hugh. Thanks for your time.